I think of the life of a miner who must work all his day underground, where his lamplight is all that will shine there, and it's dark and it's damp all around. It is 2 or 3 miles to the coal face, and the tunnel is jagged and low, but he cannot find work on the surface, so it's down in the mines he must go.
And a very good evening to you, and welcome along to Kilronan Castle, where we're continuing on with our series of interviews with former miners. And indeed, this evening is going to be with the families of a former miner. One of the most iconic photographs from the whole time of the mines in Arigna would have been that of Eugene McPartland. And indeed, Eugene's images still live on in the mining experience to this very day. His daughter, Dawn, joins us here this evening to look back on Eugene's career in the mines and indeed her memories from that, and of course when they closed in 1990 and the subsequent years. Dawn, you're very welcome. Thank you indeed for joining us. We had the pleasure of catching up with you during a very special night here in Kilronan Castle about 12 months ago, when there was a miners' reunion, and some of the stories about your dad that time were absolutely brilliant to hear. And his life as a miner started very young. It was almost from national school straight into the mines.
Yeah, so Daddy started in the mines in 1957, 14 years of age, headed off working in the mines, no secondary school for him to go to. So his first mine to work in was Spine Cop.
Mm-hmm.
And he would do a night shift there, not the dark or the black night shift, but an earlier night shift. I think it was something like 4 to 12. And he would walk to the mines. But there was a particular area on the road that was supposed to have been haunted at the time. And he was afraid to walk back home by this spot in the dark. So his mother would have to get up at night and go walk up and meet him, so that he was able to get by this part of the road to get home.
And if anybody looked at the photographs of Eugene, they would say, this big, strong man afraid of anything. But bearing in mind he was only 14 at the time.
14, he was a child doing a man's job.
Yeah, and there was an awful lot of kind of stories from that time, you know. There was more belief probably in ghosts and spirits at that stage as well. So you probably went back to maybe all the stories that would have been told in the houses. He was somebody who physically developed very quick. And indeed, some of the stories about the work that he could do in the mines, the weights he could lift, the machines he could use single-handed. There are so many of those stories that probably as the years go by, even more is added to them. But there's a huge amount of truth in them.
Yeah, like I think he was the only one that was using an air pick, or the youngest person to use an air pick at 16. He'd use one pillar to prop up the roof. He had no fear. I think there was a story that maybe Pius Early told us that night that a mine inspector came in and he seen this one pillar propping the roof, and Daddy was there and he says, name. And Daddy gave him his name, Eugene McPartland. He said, that's okay, I just wanted it for your inquest.
That's right.
So I don't know if it was more that Daddy was taking chances, or was it the fact that he was fearless?
Yeah.
He grew up in this environment. It became part of who he was, I suppose, and he just knew his job so well.
And he probably trusted his own ability as a miner as well.
And his abilities,
He was somebody, I suppose, very much that was a skillful miner, and he had other traits as well, and other trades after that. Muhammad Hurley, you mentioned Pius. Muhammad being Pius's brother, and we heard some great stories about him as well. He had a special name for your dad in the mines.
He called him the greatest tunnel tiger of all time.
Which was probably a fair enough, fair enough reception, or kind of a reputation for him.
It was.
You mentioned he started off in Spine Cop. He finished up his career like an awful lot of people working in the mines did in Drumnavuggy in 1990. But he was in a good few mines in between.
Well, I think he's supposed to be one of the only miners, or so he reckoned himself anyway, that worked in all 9 mines in Arigna. Yeah, and he worked for 33 years in the mines, so I'm sure he did cover the lot of them that was there. Yeah.
So it was a long length of time in it. From working in fairly cramped conditions, and where he was always on the side shoveling out coal, that was a kind of a practice he continued on if he was doing any other work, say on a car or anything in later years.
fixing cars, of course, in the 80s and 90s and lying under them. And that's the way he would always be lying, was on his side and his hand out this way, if he was doing anything. He'd tell you that himself. I don't know, was he moulded into that shape from the length of time he spent there in the mines? But it just, I suppose it was his natural stance maybe in later years.
He was somebody I've heard many stories about as being a very accomplished footballer, and we've spoken to people that would have played with St. Ronan's, that have been in the mines. Eugene Goodham would have played with St. Ronan's, but also with Alan Gales.
Yeah, he did. He played with Alan Gales, and he always said he played illegally, that it was illegal. I think, I don't really know what the
probably crossed the county boundary.
At times. Yeah, it was the fact that he was playing in County Leitrim, but yeah, in 1963 they won a junior championship, and Daddy was on that team.
Fantastic.
And, in later years, then they got their trophies, and
we have one of those photographs, and indeed we can post that in on the interview where people can look at him there and some of his Alan Gales comrades from there.
And Gay Sheeran always talks about when Daddy would turn up to football training in his wellies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those were the boots that he used on his.
They were his football boots as wellies, yeah. But even in later years, he loved his wellies. He always wore his wellies. He thought.
Yeah. He was somebody that always had a keen interest in Gaelic games as well.
Oh, big time, yeah. The love of his life, Roscommon, of course. He'd be in great form the day they'd win, but by God, if they lost, you'd know it. St. Ronan's as well, of course. He ate and breathed football.
Yeah.
And even with the grandchildren, it was the topic of conversation. And if a lot of them are playing for St. Ronan's and they're training, and he'd go to their games and watching them and mentoring them, and that was the whole talk in the house, was football. And if there was a game on, it'd be a big rush on Daddy that day, home to watch the game. He'd be glued to it. Yeah.
He was somebody that was always surrounded by family, always surrounded by children, and the fact that he had seven himself, and then, as you mentioned, after so many grandchildren. When the mines closed in 1990, his role changed significantly, but he took to it like a duck to water as well.
Yeah. So in 1990, the mines closed, and then, of course, as we all know, there was some courses and things set up for miners to maybe retrain them and their wives and whatnot. And my mum went out and done some of these courses, and Daddy took over her role in the house. But he was a great cook. He would always make sure everyone was fed every evening on his way home from work. Yeah. He went to the shop. He went to Laden's shop every evening. There was a bag of groceries bought. There was treats for the kids. And the newspaper was got, and that was read from back to front. And he continued that throughout his whole life. But shopping and cooking and taking us to school and doing our homework with us. And
a huge advocate, you were saying, for education. He was very much encouraging you to.
Very much, yeah. I mean, I suppose he wanted us to have maybe a better and an easier life than what he had. And you wouldn't be let go to bed at night until you knew your stories and your poems and your spellings off by heart. And the next morning you'd be asked them again, and you'd be reminded of them when he'd be walking you to school. And even when there was no school, he tried to make you go to school.
Yeah.
The bus isn't coming today because we've no school. Well, I'll leave you in anyway, but there's no school, Daddy. Well, go in anyway and do your books, he'd say, Yeah. So he really wanted us all to get educated and have an easier life. And he loved, we used to sit in the evening watching Blackboard Jungle, and in later years The Chase and all the quiz shows. And
how did he feel about his sons following him into the mines?
He wasn't happy about that, and neither was my mother. They didn't want them going to it. I think they started out by going maybe up on a Saturday to help Daddy out, just as a weekend thing, and then they got the taste for it, and they got the taste for the money, and off they headed. But neither Daddy nor my mother were happy about that. But it didn't last too long for them anyway.
They were young, Gino and Fenton, when the mines closed.
So,
we spoke about how he very much loved life locally. Fishing, I think, was a hobby of his as well. Any other hobbies?
Yeah, farming and fishing, and he loved the land, and he loved his beloved meadow was a place he loved to spend time. He'd walk over the meadow in later years 3 and 4 times a day, and if he ever was away, all he'd want was to get back to the meadow and the place. And that was
his happy place.
Yeah, it was his happy place. Yeah.
His photograph is obviously iconic with mining right throughout the last number of years, and we'll talk more about some of the other images in just a couple of minutes. But there's a very poignant story to this particular image here, and tell me where you came across this photograph done, and unfortunately you came across it shortly after Eugene had passed away.
Yeah. So about 2 weeks after Daddy had died in November of 21, I was out walking in Manorhamilton, and I just looked into the window of the sculpture centre, and this image was looking out at me. And I kind of thought I was seeing things, and I looked and I checked the hands and I said, that has to be Daddy. So I investigated it more, and I found out that this painting was done in 2004 by a local man, Benny Clancy, who's also passed away. And he done it from the brochure of the Erigna mines. So yeah, Daddy never seen this image, and I suppose never realised how iconic it was and how famous it was. But yeah, so Benny's wife gifted me that, or gifted the family that after Daddy's death. So yeah.
Which was absolutely fantastic to have such a memory. And he was obviously so young in that as well. We talked about the various photographs and the memorabilia from the Erigna mining experience as well. And there's a number of, I suppose, many of the various images and newspaper cuttings and so on have got the photographs of Eugene. That's the Erigna mining experience and advertisement for it. And Eugene very much has been the iconic face of it.
The Weekender in 2016, So
and
it hops up everywhere.
You told us a great story here the night that we were interviewing you as well, in relation to, you were above in the mining experience in the cafe. There came a bus of US tourists.
Yeah.
And your dad was a celebrity among them.
Well, the reason he was actually there that day was to film for a programme called Lesser Spotted Journeys Ireland.
Okay.
So he had a segment on that, and I actually forget the name of the interviewer, but he interviewed Daddy up in the mining experience. And while we were there waiting for that to take place, we were sitting at a table in the cafe, and Daddy had his back to the opening of the cafe, but I could see all these women standing, looking in and elbowing each other and saying, it is him, and they actually had the brochure and they had a postcard of him, and he couldn't see any of this going on behind him.
Right.
And they must have got the courage, and they braved it, and they walked up to him, and they still were looking, and they were kind of having a bit of an argument between themselves, and the next thing, one of them put her head down and she put the postcard in and under him, and she said, is that you? Well, he said, it's supposed to be. Now, he didn't get too excited, and he wasn't lapping up the attention or anything. He would have preferred no attention, and he looked up at them, and they said, is that you? And he says, it is me, it is, yeah. And they couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that they met this man that was on this brochure. So, and they had postcards as well, and then they pushed the postcards in, and they says, well, would you sign these for us? And again,
an autograph.
An autograph, yeah. He says, he looked at me and he says, what'll I put on them? I said, just sign your name, you know.
Yeah.
And they went off so happy with the postcards and the brochures. And afterwards, he says to me, who was that crowd? I says, oh, there were a busload of active age people that had come to visit the mining experience. Well, he said, you know something? They're red daft. As you know, and his point was that they had any putting any attention on him or thinking that this was a great.
Well, they were delighted to have met a living legend.
Yeah.
Another one of the photographs we have here, again, is from a newspaper cutting. The headline is North by Northwest, make mine a coal one. And again, a wonderful interview with your late dad in it. And he was probably somebody, I'd say, Dawn, that journalists loved to catch up with, because from the photograph perspective, they had this absolute giant of a man who, I suppose, symbolised for everything what mining was about. Tough, took no nonsense, did his work. Yeah. But at the same time, he was such a fascinating person to talk to, and I presume to interview, where they could get these stories from.
Yeah, like Daddy, he'd talk naturally, and if he was here now, he'd tell you just as it was, and he'd talk away naturally, and he'd have no problem doing that. But yeah, like he didn't actually know who had taken that photograph of him.
Yeah.
And we didn't know for a long time. This photograph appeared, and we often tried to pin it down to a year or who had taken it. But I think we found out that it was a David Knight that took the photograph of him. Yeah, but like Daddy said, at that time, cameras wouldn't have been that plentiful, and a lot of the time he'd come out of work in the evening, and there would be tourists up there on the top of the mountain taking photographs of the view and stuff. But they just happened to get that iconic image, and it lives on, and we're so lucky to have it.
Absolutely.
And it's only probably now, since his death, that we realise how lucky we are.
Yeah, and it just shows the esteem that he was held in. Life in Arigna, obviously for him, we touched on the GAA, and he was a great family man. Ran the house for a while. Then after that, after 1990, and he was somebody, I suppose, in many ways that was so versed in life locally and enjoyed it locally.
Yeah, like he did when he was working in the mines. Of course, he would frequent Flynn's, as a lot of them did. You know, it became a way of life, and it became a habit. And McCrann's and Tom Andy's, and he'd go to football matches with the Flynn's. You know, they'd all go off maybe to Croke Park for the day, and yeah, he loved the local life. He loved the farm, as I said. He loved the land. He looked after his mother and father when they got in later years and got into ill health. So local life was for Daddy. He never really travelled much further outside of Roscommon or Rignan.
It was very interesting as well to note the type of diet that he had. Maybe when he was working in the mines, and he kept it going in afterlife as well. He was very much into fresh food.
Yeah, like his piece, I think that's what they call it in the mines. His piece consisted of a block of Calvita cheese and 2 or 3 slices of dry bread, as he called it. He didn't eat butter, and a bottle of tea. And that was his lunch, and that was what kept him going for the day. And then he carried that on into later years. He shopped locally every day. He would go to Drumshambo every day, and he'd get fresh food. He didn't want anything out of the bigger supermarkets or anything like that. It was all fresh food, fresh fish every day. Yeah. He loved to cook. He loved cooking, and he loved eating. And you know, if you were along with him for a day, if you were anywhere, it was always about food. We'll go and we'll eat. Yeah. You know, and that was just
It was
simple things in life.
Yeah. Pivotal part of the day in it. Yeah. You've heard probably so many stories about him since he was in the mines and the work that he did. And, you know, everybody that spoke to us was about how they got on so well at him in the mines. He was somebody probably a lot of miners looked up to as well.
Oh, of course, yeah. Like, I mean, Daddy would have his work done that quick, and he would have, you know, enough work done maybe early in the day, and he'd always stay on, and he'd help younger miners or new starts that had come in. He'd always give them a hand out and help them to get their work done and direct them and advise them. Okay. And there was great camaraderie among them in the mines, or in the pit as we call it. And he had so many friends. He made great friends there, and he always talked about them. You know, the likes of Sean Wynn, or Sean the Painter, as we know him as, and Hughie Byrne, Sean Christie, men from Drumkieran, further afield, Killavuggy. He'd attend their funerals. I remember he was after having his hip done, I think it was about 2013, and he couldn't drive after having it done, and he was on the crutches, and nothing would do him when he go down to a funeral in Killavuggy. And I said, whose funeral have you to go to in Killavuggy? I had to bring him down. Men he worked with in the pit, you know.
And those friendships obviously meant a lot to him, and he wanted to be sure of that. Final question, I suppose, everywhere you look at the mining experience and when the mines are associated, is always going to be associated with you, always going to be associated with your dad. There's probably a feeling of nostalgia, probably a feeling of regret that he's gone to his eternal reward. But I presume there's an awful lot of pride there as well, Dawn.
Oh, of course, yeah. Like, we are so proud of that picture. We're proud, we're lucky. You know, it's a talking point. People wouldn't believe me when I told them initially that, you know, outside of Arigna, this is my dad, and they'd say, oh, no, he's not. It couldn't be. That's an image from a movie or something. And I'd say, no, it's my dad. And I'd tell Daddy this, and he'd say, oh, you know, it wouldn't take any effect on him. But pride, and he's iconic. He's a hero, and he'll live on.
Well, no doubt about it.
He will live on. And it's lovely for his grandchildren. And now the great-grandchildren are coming along, and it's a lovely
absolutely.
So we're
and all the photographs that I know, one final one that I just want to show on camera as well. This is one that you got commissioned as well. Tell me a little bit about this one to finish off. And I suppose, again, everything we need to know about Eugene is here in the image.
Even I think the pin is there in his shirt actually as well, you know, and that was his uniform. This shirt, the pin in it, that was an old suit jacket, I suppose, that made its way to becoming a work jacket.
A work jacket. And that's what all the men wore at the time in the mines, isn't it?
Daddy didn't like to be tightened into anything. He didn't like anything up around his neck.
Yeah.
I could show you 100 photos of Daddy, and they would all be, every shirt would be open down.
Up and
to
down,
there.
yeah.
Yeah, he didn't like to be enclosed, which is funny for the 33 years of work he done in being enclosed. But yeah, and that was the way he dressed. And,
Absolutely.
I got that done by a local artist in Manor Hamilton. He done it from the brochure for me, and yeah,
The attention to detail is fantastic.
it's fantastic. Yeah, down to his hair,
Yeah.
everything. Like, it's.
Well, look at it. It's brilliant to have so many memories. Dawn, thank you so much indeed for sharing some of those memories with us here this evening for this series of interviews. And I know there'll be so many people that will be going on the walks and watching and listening to this, and they will have seen the photographs. And it gives them a very valuable insight into what Eugene McPartland, the man that he was, and a little bit of information about him. And thank you so much for sharing that.
Thank you, John, for giving me the opportunity to talk about Daddy, because it's lovely to remember him, and to get that opportunity to talk about him, keep his memory alive.
Dawn,
thank you, John.
Thank you so much.
I think of the life of a miner who must work all his day underground, where his lamplight is all that will shine there, and it's dark and it's damp all around. It is 2 or 3 miles to the coal face, and the tunnel is jagged and low, but he cannot find work on the surface, so it's down in the mines he must go.